Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jago Dodson. I'm the Director of the Centre for Urban Research here at RMIT University and also the Chair of the Urban Futures Graduate Research Symposium, which has been running all week as part of RMIT's kind of community of practice around PhD research, where we bring all the PhD students who are doing their milestones at various levels together in a week for an intensive week of milestone activity, and then have a set of plenary activities like the session today in addition to those milestones. Before we get into the agenda, I'd just like to acknowledge the Woiwurrung and Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose lands RMIT conducts its business, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also recognise the elders of the groups across the country, First Nations groups across the country, on whose lands and waters RMIT conducts its wider business. So today, this session is talking transport with PhD students, connecting the theme of the Graduate Research Symposium with recent work that's being done principally within the Centre for Urban Research on transport topics. And I think it's notable within the centre that over the last year or so, we've had a large group of students will come through and complete, and some just start up doing work on transport topics, many of which have a very strong applied dimension to them, addressing current issues in transport planning in Melbourne, whether at the local or state scale, or in jurisdictions elsewhere. And so we thought it would be a good opportunity in this context to bring a selection of these students together, and the graduates, as some of them now are, to present on either their recent PhDs or their current PhD work in progress, but also, given that intention around applied and connected work, to bring esteemed colleagues from government into the conversation to kind of respond to, reflect upon, comment on the PhD work that's being presented. So we're really pleased to have Taru Jain from Department of Transport and Planning and Richard Smithers from the City of Melbourne, who've kindly agreed to join us today to provide exactly that commentary. So the format will be about 5 minutes of verbal presentation from each of the PhD contributors today in turn, and then we'll have some reflections and comments from Taru and Richard, and then we'll have open the floor to questions and so forth. So it'll take about an hour, and there's lunch waiting for us at the end. Before we break for lunch, though, there will be some best poster awards handed out, because as part of the symposium, we ran a poster competition with some prizes attached to it. So we'll have a quick couple of minutes just before we go to lunch to present those prizes, or announce those prizes. So I'd now like to welcome Helen Rowe to take a seat or come to the podium, whichever you prefer. Maybe we've got maybe come to the podium, and then as we work through, each presenter takes a seat to talk about your work, Helen.
Thanks, Jago. Excuse me, hay fever season. I'm a little bit coffee, all that lovely wattle has some payback. Hi everyone, and thanks for making time out of your day to come and listen to us speak about our PhD research. 5 minutes, distilling your PhD research into 5 minutes. I'll start talking very quickly. But I guess today my research topic, there it is, already up there, is really looking at, I've been working in transport for sort of 20 years or so, and a topic that I have been interested in for most of my career is this idea of how do we affect change? We kind of know what the policies are in transport that can have an impact, but many of us spend our entire career literally trying to build one bike lane and not having a lot of success. So I was interested in unpacking this research. So today I cannot give you the full breadth of the research, but I can give you a little bit of a landscape of one component of this. So I guess the main questions I was looking at here were, how do practitioners, and I interviewed people in Melbourne, Auckland and Vancouver, and I went into each city and I said, who do you think is good at making change? And I talked to people about who their peers were that they thought were good at that. And then I snowballed from there and asked them, well, who else do you think is good at making change happen? So I interviewed these people and I uncovered, how are they approaching change? And as part of that conversation, also unpacked how have they developed these insights and these capabilities over the course of their career. And then I guess the third part of the PhD is also what are some of the resistance they receive to going about this work as well. So I'll just touch on the first part of this in the session today. That's how do people tend to affect change or go about trying to affect change. And broadly speaking, from the interviews and the analysis of the research, they kind of fall into three categories. So the first category is, I guess, approaches to affecting change where you're trying to unpack sort of some direct barrier to it on the ground implementation. So this could be trying to put it in a bike lane or a bus lane. There's a whole bunch of tactics and approaches around communicating with the community, managing change, and not just with the community, but inside your own organisation and institution. So, the engineers in your organisation are a bit concerned about safety of doing things in a different way. So that's kind of the first category. And I'd say in this regard, there's really valid knowledge and know-how in that category, but also quite a lot of it just falls flat. You can legitimately be able to affect change, but sometimes it doesn't matter how good you are at doing those things, you're still not going to get that bike lane in or the bus lane in or whatever the change is on the ground you're trying to do. So that goes on to the next category, which is around, I guess, more systemic approaches to affecting change. So you might have been trying to do that kind of work and it's failed. So you're looking at what's the next upstream lever I could be targeting to then implement that change. So again, a bunch of strategies here. Often they might be looking at kind of what are the rules or guidelines or what's that next upstream thing that might be blocking that change from happening. Sometimes it's about, governance, maybe mechanisms a bit more than if that's where you're sort of seeing the blocking happening. It could also be about if you've been able to affect change on the ground, might be you thinking about how you're scaling that change. Because ultimately I think the change that all these practitioners, often like people like in this room, and they've done a degree in urban planning or transport planning, they're really thinking about how do we make that paradigm shift happen around moving away from car-centric cities. This leads us to the third category. So again, you might have some luck making those changes happen, but that may all evaporate. You may manage to change a rule and then somehow it gets changed back, or somehow that gets kind of unwound in front of your eyes. So I think you reach this point as a practitioner, and in the interviews, you can kind of see these categories also falling in across people's careers. They get to the point where they could actually just get totally fed up and get to the point of feeling like they're going to give up. Or if they've had some particular experiences, maybe led them to think about things in another way, or often by a bit of luck, they've been exposed to some kind of framework or thinking or discipline that enables them to really look at the system and think about, okay, not just the next upstream leveraging point, but how does this thing work as a system, and where's the acupuncture point I might want to target to make change happen. So this last category is more, I guess, looking at the systemic change, whereas the previous category is just more kind of a bit more strategic. So here things like exposure to things like transitions theory and transitions management, systems thinking, some frameworks from health, looking at population health, things, all sorts of ideas. But I guess the shift that happens here is from working on change from within the system, so working on change in the system, to working on change on the system, looking at the system as a whole. Let me know when I've hit my 5 minutes. I feel like I've already 1 minute to go. So this is really, I guess, the progress over people's career. And one of the interesting things just as a bit of a teaser for the last part of the research is this is a really hard process. Often these professionals, and I'd ask people, do you think the approach you've had to change has changed over your career? The most common thing that people said, and this is sometimes engineers who've been working for 30 years, absolutely. When I started working, I thought I should have the right answer. And people, when I explained that to them, change would happen. And I've spent a whole career having to learn these skills myself, but not coming into the career actually understanding this is actually part of the job. So I think that's an area where I think there's a lot of area for learning and reflection, and also a lot of area for improvement in terms of how we build up, even in education facilities like this, how we prepare people for going into work in transport and actually bringing about change on the ground. I'll wrap up there.
Great, thank you very much, Helen. I'd now like to invite Dr. Luisiana Paganelli to the podium to give us 5 minutes on your work.
Thank you very much, Jago. Okay, can I use this? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Okay, so car sharing, that was the topic of my research. And it is not Uber, carpooling. Car sharing is a service that people can use to rent a car, like a short rental, to use a car when they need, and they need to drive. So that's the car sharing I'm talking about. And that has a lot of potential to contribute to urban sustainability. But this can only happen if car sharing is integrated to urban planning and transport systems, and it's used as a complement to the other mobility options available. Car sharing matters because my accent got stronger. I was in Brazil for some time, so sorry. It matters because people don't need to have a car. If car sharing is available, and they tend to use more sustainable transport, walk, cycle, use public transport more, because they have access to a car whenever they need. There is a lot of interest in increasing support to car sharing and integrating it to the systems. But this kind of car sharing has not received as much attention as needed so far in research, in practice, and policy debates. So the consequence is that probably cities are not reaping all the benefits or taking advantage of all the sustainability benefits that car sharing can generate. So another point is that also planners and policymakers, decision makers, don't really know how to deal with car sharing or integrate car sharing effectively. So that's what I wanted to explore, especially the role of governance in supporting car sharing as an integrated transport mode, and somehow to understand what's in this image, where car sharing sits within the transport systems, either closer to the sustainable mobility or automobility or in another part of this system. So what I did, a very big multiple cases and global cases study to explore how car sharing is governed in different parts of the world and identify how it can be integrated. That went from a very general overview to a detailed approach. And I started this by developing a conceptual framework, which I'm calling the CSGI framework, it's car sharing governance integration. I defined what car sharing governance is. I combined it with policy theories of some existing framework and used that as my analytical tool. So then I found some cities around the world that could teach me about car sharing governance and answer the questions I had. Then I went literally on a global field work. I was lucky enough to live before COVID to Europe, North America, Asia, and around Australia. I did 112 interviews, completely nuts, a lot of document reviews, field work observation, but that was amazing. From these, I got a global overview, which is the general, 5 mini cases that I call promising cases from Milan, Bremen, Ghent in Europe, Vancouver in Canada, and Singapore. And then I did a very detailed regional approach an analysis of 11 Melbourne LGAs, so Melbourne and the surrounding ones. So what I found with this whole global study, the results illustrated and confirmed my framework. That was the first, and they showed how complex car sharing governance is. They also showed very general characteristics of car sharing governance, and the main ones are lack of awareness and experience with the mode among the core actors, regulatory fragmentation, normally standalone policies or separate ones to deal with car sharing, inconsistencies between how cities in the same region deal with car sharing, and also how cities see car sharing and deal or do something for it. And also the final is the path dependence of planning for cars applied for car sharing. Most of the arrangements were based on resolving car parking and guided by the car dominance and path dependence, which was a bit different in successful cases internationally, the promising cases that I mentioned. So the key finding of my thesis was that, this was the right one. So the key finding is that car sharing is in concept perceived as beneficial and sustainable and could be part of the sustainable mobility realm, let's say. But in practice, it's addressed and managed as a car or a motor vehicle and a parking problem, which approximates car sharing to the automobility. So based on these findings, I made some propositions. And the three main ones are that car sharing is governed using two main structures, governance structures. And it's tricky because the outcomes are probably in the sustainable mobility one, but the infrastructure is in the automobility. It is still a car, but we need to deal with it differently. And the other one are some logics. So there is a rationality and some logics applied to governance arrangements for car sharing. And they're basically considering car sharing as a loss of, yeah, that's almost the last, yeah, thank you. Considered as a loss of space and parking revenue, or financial cost of management, installation, and compensation for the losses, private profit, because it is perceived as a profit-oriented business that makes a lot of money, which is not really accurate sometimes, benefiting from the use of public space. And less frequently as an instrument for sustainability or increased accessibility and infrastructure improvements, which was found in the promising cases. So the last one, a proposition I made is that I identified some policy intentions in governance arrangements for car sharing, in which governments tend to choose either to allow, enable, incorporate, or integrate car sharing. And this creates levels of integration of the mode. And the closest, the more integrated and higher, it's closest to the sustainable mobility. It means it can become a complement to the system. And so the main conclusions of my research were that governance has fundamental roles in supporting car sharing. It is what can legitimately integrate the mode, acting as a key enabler of the development and shaping how it's implemented. So for that, car sharing has to be addressed and governed as a special transport mode with consistent arrangements and a conducive or positive policy environment. That would mean accepting its complexity and reducing this tension between it's a car, it's not a car, or the operational and management issues. So that would mean maybe a tailored governance structure in a holistic, and consistent way for the city to reap the actual benefits of car sharing. So, thank you.
Thank you, Luisiana. And I'd like to invite Dr. Eric Keys to talk about his experiences with the Metro Tunnel.
Thank you, Jago. And I will be increasingly vigorous with time.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone. The opportunity to have a captive audience that I can talk to about my PhD research is a rare and pleasurable opportunity. What is planning, and what do I mean when I say I'm a planner? These are the motivating questions that really got me into my PhD program. And in the few minutes I have, I just want to sort of hopefully leave you with three messages about what I found when I studied planning practice. Firstly, planning practice is nothing like we would read about in textbooks and in the theory of planning. Secondly, planners don't have a particular insight into what's good and bad. And of course, these questions then beg the question of what is it that planners actually do? And what I found from my research and what I'll spend the next few minutes talking about is we get engaged to settle matters of concern. And I'll elaborate what that means as I go through. My thesis was an auto-ethnographic account of 12 months' work I did on the Melbourne Metro project. Ethnography is the study of cultures, so it's a cultural study, and autos is of course means self. So it was a study of my own culture, my own tribe. There's plenty of literature that says autoethnographic studies are an exercise in self-indulgence, and they probably are. Now, I'm not actually going to talk about the Melbourne Metro project. My thesis is currently being held in escrow because we have shown abundance of caution that we don't cause any harm in the work we do. But what I want to do, will talk about in the remaining minutes I have, is how the PhD helped me reflect on my 30 years of planning practice. So takeaway one is planning is not what many people think it is. Making plans, weighing options, devising strategies are common perceptions of what planners do. Yet when we looked around us, we see projects that are implemented that were never part of a plan, and plans that are written that are never implemented. The idea of planning is plan making is what you can find in the literature is called a naive view of planning. You know, more generously, we could call it a normative account of what planning should be. Planners are called upon to deal with the concerns of the day. We get called in when there are matters of concern, when there are matters being contested, and they throw the problem to a planners and say, you go sort it out. And so we are engaged to settle these matters of concern. And so we take this societal role of bringing some certainty to uncertain situations. Planners are rarely the decision makers themselves, but good planners will influence those decisions. And the very best of planners will be so successful at influencing those decisions that they'll be perceived as people with power. And there's a whole dedicated literature to that. The second point I'd make is planners have no special insight into what's right or wrong. And in my thesis, I looked at the Sydney Opera House that's celebrating 50 years today. Now, famous planning scholars have written at length about the Sydney Opera House as a project. Peter Hall called it a great planning disaster. Brent Fleurberg claims it is a classic example of projects that run over time, over budget, and fail to deliver their intended outcomes. Yet you ask anyone else about the Sydney Opera House, it's enormously successful. It's an iconic project. And so we get this discontinuity between what normative planning theory teaches is right and wrong and what happens in the real world. Similarly, again, with hindsight, we say that the metropolitan plans that were developed in the 50s have sort of embedded this car dependency. And we're now reaping the consequences of that car dependency. Louisiana spoke to that at the moment, just a few minutes ago. This illustrates the problem of unintended consequences, and it's a problem that planners face right throughout the career. So if planners if planners don't plan the way we think they plan, if society doesn't work the way we think planning should work, if planners don't really know what's right and wrong, what is it that planners really do? That's the third point. We deal with these matters of concern. We get engaged where organisations have matters of concern, and it doesn't matter whether it's a planning application coming into a council office or if you're tasked to find the location for a new metro station. These are all unsettled matters that must be settled, and that's what planners get asked to do. And what planners do, when you look at them in terms of what actually happens in their day-to-day role, they engage with all sorts of things. They do surveys, they conduct analysis, they do consultations, they consult with owners, they deal with car shares, or we'll hear about battery charges and car charging. We deal with things, and so the planner's world is this world of things. And we use those things, we line those things up as allies in the process of bringing settlement to a situation. So once the decision's made, things are settled, and the planners can then move on to the next matter of concern. So as a planner, as a transport planner, I've always said the last thing I want anyone to do is to build a project, because then I can't plan it anymore. Once it's built, it's done, I move on to the next one. So just to sort of recap now, my PhD allowed me to reflect on my experience as a practicing planner. The Melbourne Metro project was a useful case study where many issues arose in my day-to-day work that had to be resolved. And through the in-depth analysis and reflection on how they were resolved, I managed to develop the insights I've just shared with you. Ethnography allowed me to reflect on what I did and how I interacted with those around me, including the many things I used in the day-to-day work. Through the discipline of reading, writing, reflection, I discovered that planning is not what most people think it is. Planning is not a font of wisdom when it comes to the question of what should we do, but they do play a vital role in the complex process of social construction that is the practice of planning. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Eric. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Afshin Jafari to the podium to present.
Okay, thanks, Jago. I'm not sure if I can call myself a recent graduate, but appreciate the opportunity to present the work. I did my PhD in Center for Urban Research, School of Global Social Studies, Global Urban Social Studies, and now I'm a research fellow there. And today I wanted to talk about what did I do in my PhD and how I'm building on that to create this program of research that I'm keen to create as I'm going forward in my career as a researcher. So basically, as the title says, I built a large-scale agent-based simulation model for cycling for transport in Melbourne. So there are lots of jargons there. I don't want to go about every individual word and what they mean, but in essence, what I did was, so my background is in engineering and computational science, and typically in most transport models that I dealt before, it was car-oriented or public transport-oriented. So we didn't have much about active transport in these types of modeling. And over the last decade, transport modeling became very, very important in lots of decision-making that is happening in a strategic level in first world countries. And that really made me think about, okay, what are the requirements of having a same tool, but for cycling? Something that is really, really micro, something that when you're on your bike, you interact with everything. You interact with the pedestrian that is passing next to you, you interact with the weather, a slope, everything is different. So that was the idea behind my PhD. And is this the thing? And to do that, a few things I needed to do. So before being able to have that model and test interventions and those types of things. So I needed to have representation of the travelers in Melbourne. So every individual, synthetic individuals, we call them, where they go, how they go, what street they use to go from A to B and those types of things. So we call that model supply or the travel demand of the model. Sorry, that was model demand and travel demand. So supply is the road infrastructure and public transport infrastructure, footpaths, all those types of things. So that's the supply. That was the other one, the demand. So with the supply, what I mean is that where are the bike lanes? Where are the public transport stops? What's the road capacity and those types of things? And I explained the demand. And then the third component was to create something that these two meet each other. So how individuals that I have included in my demand, how they use the infrastructure from going A to B, and how they change behavior once something changes in the environment. So you build a bike lane, what happens? Like, do people start cycling? Who starts cycling? Why they are starting cycling? And those types of things. And and one point is that models are really simplified realities. So they are not everything. They are not, you can't use a model to predict everything. They are built for a specific purpose and they can only be used for that specific purpose. And my model was only to use what will happen if you change something in the built environment, like adding a new bike lane in terms of what route people choose and what mode they choose. So this is an example of the output of the model, just to show you how it looks like. So different colors are different types of bicycle infrastructure. Those are cyclists going around, CBD coming, I think it's morning AM peak. And so I don't have interventions here, but I also tested two different interventions. One was adding some of the planned bike lanes in Greater Melbourne called strategic cycling corridors, and see what happens if you build those. So there are planned corridors. Some of them are built, some of them not. But what would happen if you build all of them? Who start cycle? What happens to the traffic? Because all the discussion is that if you build a bike lane, congestion will be out of control. And I showed that it's not the case. And there is a QR code there if you want to learn more about the model, because as I said, we created basically a complete transport model for Greater Melbourne for the purpose of cycling. So we have everything. We have car, public transport, pedestrians, and cyclists. And there is a web page there that explains more about the details of the model and who was involved. And that's, I think, a good segue to say that the project was a big project, and lots of different skills and experts from different disciplines were involved. So we have computer science scientists, GIS experts, and active travel experts all working on this together. And that brings me to my last point. What I want to say is that why I think Center for Urban Research and School of Global Urban Social Studies was the good choice and right place for this type of a study. Because when we say transport modeling, immediately I think people think about engineering and those types of a school. But what I found in Center was that it enabled me to connect to the audience that I wanted to connect with my model. And that's, I think, really important. And that's one of the things that I think is missing when you are just thinking about building a tool and not really caring about the users and audience. So those are some of the workshops that I had for building the model. And one of them actually is the recent workshop, the one at the top that I had earlier this year, talking about the next steps of the model and what I want to go with it afterwards. And we have an open repository for every code and all the things that are happening background. So this is like we build this model, but we don't say that this is something that we don't want to share. We do want to share. We do want people to use them. So we put everything that we done online, available for everyone to use. It's not super user friendly, so that's the issue. And that's something that I'm working on next with some projects to make it easier for people to use. But yeah, so that's the open science part of it. And we are continuing on this, hopefully going to other regions in Victoria, moving from a Melbourne model to a state model, and adding more details to this. For example, public transport is one of the things that we want to look into in more detail. And electric vehicles, e-charging, those are also discussions that we are having. But yeah, so the idea is that I started something in collaboration with lots of great people, and now we are continuing building on that, and hopefully you will hear more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashton. I'd now like to invite Dr. Tami Crozer to the lectern to give his presentation.
Hello, everyone. You might not expect this, but if you work in transport policy, transport planning, transport engineering, you are one of the most important people who will determine whether our city is actually ready for climate change. When we have the heat waves which last above 40 degrees for 7 days, when we get a 250 millimeter rainfall in 2 hours, it will be transport that is determinative. I'll tell you why. Let's look at the City of Melbourne's canopy target on what it's going to take to keep the city cool next time we have a big heat wave. They need 40% canopy cover over public land by 2040. I did the numbers. That translates to 180 hectares of new canopy cover over the city in 17 years. Doing that means planting at really large scale right now, because 180 hectares is sort of, I think it's 90 MCGs. It's a vast area of land. We can have arborists, we can have ecologists, we can have landscape architecture. They're all important, but what it's going to take to deliver that scale of change is a systematic reallocation of asphalted and concreted space in our cities to green space. It's the same for flood risk. If you look at the Elizabeth Street catchment which is sitting in, Elizabeth Street used to be a river. The catchment around it is quite small. We need to rip up 65 hectares of concrete and asphalt in order to get the city just off extreme flood risk. City's target for that is 2030. So we've got 7 years to do that. So I'm fascinated with how we actually get more space in cities for urban greening. And I'll talk you through a little paper which was about parking, where I got really interested in parking for a brief period. So the reason I got excited about parking is Melbourne's got 25,000 car parking spaces on our city streets. That translates to about 50 hectares of space. It's quite a lot, but it is vastly outnumbered by the parking that we have in garages. We have over 200,000 spaces sitting in parking garages. Some of it's apartments, some of it's offices, some of it's commercial car parks. But we know at least for apartments, that there's quite high rates of vacancy. And I think we can assume that for offices and commercial garages, there's probably a bit of spare space there too. So I went and did the numbers deep in the pandemic and got a bit obsessed with this. And I came back and found, to my amazement, that if we only used parking spaces on street and moved them into buildings within a 200-meter walk, and we only used 10% of the capacity in apartment buildings and 30% of the capacity in commercial buildings, we would free up 9,000 car parking spaces on the city's streets. That translates to over 20 hectares of space, and that can be the foundation for major climate adaptation activity, as well as things that bring nature back into our cities and mean that we can encounter biodiversity. So I got really excited. I called my mate, Dr. Casey Bissington, who's a skilled designer, and I said, let's design up a simple modular green intervention that we can cookie cutter out across through these sites as a basis for some modelling. And we ended up with a really simple design, which has got a big tree in it. It's got understory planting with native vegetation to support biodiversity, and it's also a sunken design, so it catches rainwater. And just at the end of this presentation, I will show you what that might look like. But what we did with that, crucially, was we had a pragmatic, realistic bit of design that we could then model. And I called my mates who could model, and I said, Dr. Holly Kirk, specialist in connecting habitats and understanding how animals move through cities, how would this change how bees and birds move through the city? And we found that particularly for bee habitat, it connected up disconnected patches, and you'd have a much greater chance of seeing native invertebrates as a result of these interventions. Then I went to a tree canopy specialist at UC Davis in California, and I said, Alessandro, can we figure out how much tree canopy we'd get? And we did a whole lot of modelling based on our own city trees here, and found that it was 40 to 60 hectares of new tree canopy over asphalt, which by itself would deliver a third of the city's tree canopy target. And then finally, I went to a water engineer, Dr. Casey Furlong, one of our grads as well, and he helped me model what would happen in terms of a stormwater event and how much through the year we'd be intercepting. It was millions of litres. It was going to get us 12% of the way to our extreme flood risk target for 2030. And it would intercept tons and tons of sediment, tons and tons of litter, and also things like nitrogen and phosphorus that cause algal blooms. So great water quality outcomes as well. So that's the story of how we went from noting redundancy, seeing some space in the city, coming up with a realistic design, and then modelling its consequences. And here's how it looks. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Tami. Now I'd like to invite Mehdi Alidadi to present on his current PhD work. Mehdi just recently passed his first milestone for the first year of his PhD, so well done, Mehdi.
Hi everyone, and as Jago said, that I'm in the earlier stage of my research, and sorry if you have to hear some stuff that you already know, but I try to reflect some ideas that may be useful. My research is about the impact of high-density housing on public transport use. Generally, it means the connection between the land use or the built environment and transport. But specifically, I'll focus on high-density housing and public transport. We all know that the transport policies have shaped the cities. And after World War II, that cars emerged, we see the massive suburbanization in most of the cities around the globe. And one of the responses from the planning was to encourage more complexity, to increase the density, to encourage public transport use and those other components. And this was reflected in strategic plans of Melbourne. As you can see from the Melbourne 2030, they have very specific focus on increasing the density and encourage around the public transport nodes and routes. And also in Plan Melbourne 2050, we see that still they are encouraging higher density housing around public transport nodes. And in the real world, also we see that the number of apartment housing in the last couple of decades has been increasing. And on the media, there has been massive discussions that high-density housing could be a solution for housing affordability or to tackle the climate change and other policies that are running in Melbourne. But if we look at the literature, the science says that this built environment is not the only solution that we have. Beyond the density, beyond the built environment, there are some other factors that influence in the public transport use. By increasing the density, you do not necessarily can increase public transport use. As we can see from 2000, in the first plan of Melbourne, public transport use was 10% in 2001. And they plan to become around 20% in 2020, which was 3 years ago, and still it's 9%. So it means that the built environment is not just the solution. And other factors like the socio-demographic factors, if you are from a blue collar, you are a blue collar worker, so it means that you can't use public transport regularly. You have to work in different parts of the city. The distribution of the job is, all of the jobs are not in the CBD that most of the public transport are directed to. And you see that the distribution of the city influence public transport use. If someone has, a positive attitude to the car, by changing the built environment, you cannot change the attitude of that person to use public transport use. So that's why I will focus on this specific area to see that if there is any meaningful difference between the people who are using public transport in apartment housing and non-apartment housing. And I will focus on apartment residents to see that if it's just the built environment or other factors also influencing public transport use among residents in apartments. And also the most important factor that has been raised in the literature has been the public transport infrastructure. We see a lot of the words on media that they say we want to use public transport, but we don't want to switch our seats by seeing someone is looking at you and embarrass you that you have to give me your seats. Yeah, they respect the older people, but there should be some decent public transport to use, and we cannot just increase the density, but on the other hand, not develop or provide the same public transport, the decent public transport for that housing development is occurring and will occur in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mehdi. I'd now like to invite all the speakers to come and take a seat. Plenty of room, hopefully. Yeah, a chair for everyone. We have counted right. And now it's an opportunity for our invited industry commentators to provide their reflections, comments, or ask questions, or offer some further observations based on the presentations that we've heard from. I'm really pleased to welcome Taru Jain, who's the manager of research within, I think, the Transport Innovation Group within the Victorian Government Department of Transport and Planning. Recently had the planning added to it. And also we've got Richard Smithers, who's the manager of transport for the City of Melbourne. So maybe, okay, yes, welcome. Maybe I'll hand over to you first, Taru, for your reflections and observations.
Yep, thank you.
And we've got microphones if you...
Working? Yeah, I think it's working. No, this is, I have a mic on.
Oh, you've got a, yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Jago, and what a wonderful opportunity to be here to listen to all the amazing presentations. A big congratulations to CUR for such a great medley of research across a range of topics. Obviously, some looking at very specific sort of, themes and questions which are more technically oriented, like Afshin's work, but also some more navel gazing pieces like Eric's. So I think really made me think about my own journey as well, because I finished my PhD not very long ago, in 2020, And it was actually on the topic of car sharing as well. So, and I was looking at the idea about, this whole auto dependence in Melbourne and how how something like car sharing is doing and what impact it has on people's travel behavior. What is the role of government? So touching a little bit on the governance aspects, but not as much in detail as Louisiana. And like that really made me, and when you work on something for 3 or 4 years, you start thinking about, okay, how can my work actually make an impact on the society, on policy, and that was the big question I had as well, Helen, just speaking to your presentation, that's what we all think. We are all bright-eyed and we think we can have a big impact, and that made me join the government. It's a 4,500 organization, but I thought that yes, as manager of transport research, maybe it will be an opportunity to bring in the voice of reason into the department, connect people. So that's my role essentially. So as manager of transport research, I bring in experts from the universities and connect them to people within the organization. And the intent is to really ensure that policies and decisions, they are informed by research and insights and innovation coming from university and research. And I've found, in the past 2 years that it's easier said than done. Like it's a bit like, I'm on the inside, but I'm still the outsider because I'm trying to bring in innovation, and that can be challenging. And I'm not really dissing my employer, but I'm just saying that it's a challenge in every organization to bring about any sort of change. But really, I think Helen and Eric's work today, it made me think a little bit more about my own journey and just thinking about how, as academics and as technical people, we can sometimes think that if we provide that theoretical reasoning, if we provide enough evidence, we'll be able to create that change. And maybe we'll have time for questions later once I sort of talk through my reflections, but it's been challenging, and I've often wondered, like, what stops people from taking action, even when all the evidence is in front of you, and that's a big question. Also, I really liked Tammy's work, very interesting, and really this is about, creating, this is about, we know that this is the impact we can have with all the vegetation if we replace car parking with urban planting, but really where is that gap, where is the blockage which is stopping us from doing these things and implementing these innovative ideas. So a really big question around that as well. Yeah, so I think one reflection I have as well is that, and I'm not talking specifically about one organization, but I've found that in planning in the current times, even when we have all these big problems like housing shortage, climate change, the world is burning around us, there is enormous social disadvantage as well. And still sometimes we feel like the attention of the decision makers is on the next big, sexy, shiny object. And how do we really bring the attention back to the processes which can help us debate that a little bit more as well? So I think coming to today's session has really ignited or reignited that part of my brain. So thank you so much for that. And over to Richard.
Thanks, Tari. I think that microphone's working. Yeah, thanks, Jago, and thank you to everyone who's presented. I think the 5-minute presentation thing is a brilliant concept. It's really great to be able to get across so many things in a short time like that. And it opens up the research to bogans like me who essentially my job is I'm called the manager of transport strategy at the City of Melbourne. My first job is to write a transport strategy, and obviously I do that with a team of people and interacting with lots of people within the organisation and then people outside the organisation. Then we distilled this transport strategy. That happened in 2019. Some of the people here had a role in helping to create that. Some of the people out there had a role in helping to create that. And then once the councillors have intoned in the council meeting come to the conclusion that they are happy to support this as the City of Melbourne's transport strategy, then the job is to get it delivered. And every person who spoke today spoke to something that's in that strategy about how we create, a transport future for the City of Melbourne. And who cares about transport? It's really, actually, it's about the ecological, economic and social future of the city. Transport is merely the thing that helps people move between the activities that they want to do and moves the junk around that they want to use when they're at those places. So, for each of the presentations, I was, immediately thinking, oh, I need to find out a little bit more about that. I need to draw out a piece of this, etc. So I think, Tami, your work's kind of hits you in the face the hardest. And I remember when I first saw it, and I thought this is a classically useful thing of stretching our brains. It said, come on, this is possible. And of course, when you're in you're in the council and you're writing a councillor briefing paper or a report to go up to the future Melbourne committee, you can't leap to the point that you've leapt to, but you can refer to it. You can. So it's really helpful in stretching the discussion. I think the more we know about bike lanes and how bike lanes work, I think we've really only started our journey in terms of bike lanes, and there's so much more to know and understand. I used to work at Bicycle Network, and I remember we were absolutely certain at Bicycle Network that a protected bike lane adjacent to the curb was the wrong thing to have, and that our bike lanes needed to be on the other side of the parked cars, which is how we built bike lanes for quite a long time. It's going back quite a while, Tony. Anyway, we now understand that that the protected bike lanes make a significant difference. And so we have so much to learn about the way people interact with these, the different types of people who ride bikes, who might ride a bike under what circumstances. The car sharing, both of Mehdi's work and Lou's work goes to land use. And, I think sometimes people in council are kind of surprised that what's the transport guy talking about land for? And there's this sort of desire to kind of compartmentalise things. But, I guess essentially our transport strategy, one of the core things about it is it's an economic strategy. It's about driving greater levels of interaction between people in this space that we have. So I have a theory of the city as a compost heap, and the compost is made up of all the microbes. Now, you do not get a good compost heap if you put your leaves in one pile here, and then you put your kitchen scraps over there, and then you put your grass clippings here, right? You can watch it for 3 weeks, nothing's going to happen. You have to get it all in together, and you have to mix it all up, and that's where you get the microbial party that happens in there. That's when the heat comes off. The heat is the same as the money. Those are the interactions that drive the economy. Those are the reasons why people want to be in the city. So we see our job as driving face-to-face interaction. We are here to create a transport system that supports face-to-face interaction, whether it's for discussing people's PhDs, whether it's for buying handbags, whether it's for going out for dinner, doing business, or whatever it is. And I think that the whole thing about the public transport network supporting that action and the role of different types of housing and land use in that discussion is something that sometimes gets pushed aside when we're only talking about transport. And I think that explaining car sharing is a really hard thing to do. It's such a simple idea, but it's so difficult to get people all the way down the track to understanding that, okay, if we use car share, we don't have to fill this land up with empty boxes in the sky for cars to store in, because people don't need that anymore. You can fill it up with active land use, and if you fill it up with activity, then you get activity and you get economic development. So, yeah, I think all of the the work And when I was listening to Helen, I wrote down, is this me? You know, these mid-level actors. It's all of us. And then I wrote down, all decisions are emotional. And, you know, you can put all the evidence you like, but if you want to see transport policy in action, go to a City of Melbourne, future Melbourne Committee meeting and watch what the councillors say. They're all online. If you want to go back, I can give you some great dates to watch. And you will see that all decisions are emotional. And so the question then is, how do you bring to bear this in that council chamber at a time when the councillors are making a decision? And of course it goes for other councils. You know, people up here have affiliations with other councils, Blue in particular. You know, that you can, and so what is it that you need to present at that time that comes out of this, but that feeds that decision, which is quite often an emotional decision.
Great, thank you, Richard.
Back to base.
And thank you, Taru. So we do have a little bit of time just for some discussion, but maybe Taru and Richard, because we know many of the people in the audience are PhD students themselves as part of the Graduate Research Symposium, and one of the elements of the work that we've heard today is from PhD students who obviously have very strong connections in their work to policy questions. But I guess I'd like your advice respectively on how PhD students can better connect their work to the policy practitioners such as yourselves, so that, okay, they might be addressing policy in their work, but how to make sure that the work is known about, that there's input from policy practitioners into the kind of development of the research and advice along the way. What's the best approaches that we could use, whether it's at the individual project level or within a research centre or within the university, to facilitate more of that happening?
I think from my experience, I feel that the best time to start engaging is when you start the project. Mm-hmm. And that's not just on the student, but also on their supervisors, to ensure that the research topic itself is grounded in what really is the narrative right now and what might be helpful for the industry. I know it's not always easy to gather, but possibly, you know, better interaction in general between academia and government and industry will enable that. So, for example, in my PhD, it was a very high-level topic, but what I did and really helped me, I think after 6 months or so, I was feeling very stuck. So my supervisor, Professor Jeff Rose's advice was to actually just go and have coffees with some industry people, and nobody, I mean, if you actually say, I want to have a work meeting with you, people will probably like, okay, what's going on? But I think if you ask somebody to go for just like a coffee, you say, I'm a student and I'm seeking some feedback on my work, I mean, nobody would say no. And it's a very good idea. And the interactions which I had at that point really defined the way my project was going. I was able to seek some alignment with a local council, and I developed the main PhD survey in partnership with the council, which helped me and it helped the council. It was a symbiotic relationship. So that kind of thing can be very helpful. And just in terms of also talking about your work, it's very important to find opportunities to be present your work at different fora where there are relevant people present, and also present it in a manner where you're always constantly thinking, why would this person care about what I'm talking about? So you have to talk not as an academic, you have to talk as if you're telling a story. So that format of talking is also very important, so that you make it relevant to the people. Constantly think about what's in it for them, why would they hear? So I think that pitching is quite important.
Thanks. Richard, any thoughts?
I'd agree with Taru on that contact, and less structured can be better. Like I like what you said, I just want to bounce some ideas off you, or I'm a bit stuck, or whatever it is. It's easy for a person like me or one of my colleagues to sit down and just have a chat about that. I think that The images that Tami produced are quite powerful, and there's nothing like the communication through images. I don't know if any of you remember a person called Leanne Hoddle who did a Churchill Fellowship. She presented some pretty amazing images about the level of the intensity of development happening in this northern end of the city. And I remember that she said, well, part of the Churchill rule is that you have to tell the media about it, and the media promptly responded by putting her on the front page of the newspaper. And I think this really helped kick the debate along. That was at a time when the previous government was approving a lot of development, and lots of people are still upset about that today. So I think that sort of imagery question can be really, and I have been struggling for the right car sharing image as well. And in fact, the folks from GoGet came the other day and presented some stuff to us. So this is GoGet Car Share. And they showed the different users of the service. And I said to them, I think what you should do is not just the different users of the service with the different cars they use, the different users of the service with the same car. That's the whole point here, that the students who've come from overseas and want to go away on the weekend use the same car as the guy who runs the florist shop around here, who doesn't want to have to own a car, can't own a car, but can have a florist, you know, working as a business using car share. And that's the same as the family which lives in the city and can only live in the city because they can get access to the car share car, but on the weekend they want to go to Healesville to see the animals. So it's the same car. So I think the imagery, you know, picture in 1,000 words, I think is really worth thinking about.
I might just on this topic ask Louisiana to tell the story of the badge that you created for your PhD work. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Louisiana?
Is it working? Hi. Well, okay, thanks, Jago. Jago was my main supervisor, so that's why he knows. I did the massive global study, and I was trying to recruit people to interview. So I had a badge, and that was Jago's idea, to say like, hi, I'm Louisiana, talk to me about car sharing. And that really worked. So I used to go, and I love these events, so I would go to many, even internationally. I would go around walking, like doing this with my badge, and I really, really got interesting people, so that worked. And yeah, I could only recommend, if you ever need to do recruiting for interviews, that works. Thanks, Jago, for reminding me. That was a fun part.
Thanks, Louisiana. Maybe just before we wrap up, some comments from the PhD students yourselves. I mean, most of you, or many of you, are, in the case of Helen or Eric, already working in the transport field. What's advice that you would give to PhD students in engaging with industry who may not already be doing so?
Yeah, I mean, not sure. Oh, is that working? Yes. It's sort of similar stuff to what the rest other people are talking about. I would say it's funny. Yesterday I was in Queensland and I was meeting with TMR, which is the state transport agency in Queensland. Had some great meetings with them, and I came back and I was doing follow-up emails today. And one of the colleagues said, "Oh, hi Helen. Yeah, actually, you're already quoting your work," and they quoted my master's research from 2013, which is a paper I did on road space reallocation. And I was so excited that someone was still using this. So it's also, I think it's also the direct contact, but also just putting this stuff out in the world, like, you know, like Richard or me, at the moment trying to find data. I work at Climateworks. I'm trying to find data on assumptions around, you know, how can we decarbonise? So I was taking notes through most of the presentations on Ask Louisiana where the data is for that. Also, the data, this stuff sits out there, and it is stuff that people will Google. They're like, we've used your research to underpin our pilots and trials program to do whatever bike lanes or bus lanes. So also just having the data out there, you know, someone will Google that and someone will use it. And like in my case, that was 10 years ago. But like, yeah, it's still getting used. So I think it's just, you know, putting it out there and making it accessible so that when someone's doing that council brief, they can find that data really, really easily, and it's really accessible.
I mean, just to riff off that, I mean, we were doing our parking and curbside management plan the other day. That was maybe 6 months ago, and the discussion was about economic benefits. And so the paper that was used was a piece of work that Alison Lee did.
Still use that one?
Yeah. Now, when would that have been done? This is a piece where Alison went up to Lygon Court and the City of Melbourne had replaced 2 parking bays with about 16 bike parking spots, raised the thing up to the level of the footpath, and then quizzed everybody on how much money they spent. And of course, the bike riders spent a little bit less per visit, but they came there much more frequently, and there were 8 times as many of them. So the final economic outcome was significant. And then she went to and asked the traders, given all this, what do you think? And they said, yeah, we'd like another one, please. So, but that piece of research, how old is that, Helen?
At least 15 years.
15
yeah.
years old.
And it's still the only thing I point to. If someone asks me for data on that, I say, there's this paper about car parking on Lycon Street outside the Nova.
Still giving.
Okay, we might just take one question because we've gone a little over time, so we do need to wrap up. So maybe just one question from the floor.
Thank you. My question is about transport policy. Most of the discussions from the university's perspective and government perspective, they tend to be left-leaning. So I'm bringing a right-leaning perspective from a business perspective. So the transport infrastructure, we need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose? Is it to increase transport productivity, so reduces the business costs, or is it to discourage vehicle use in the city? As one example, the worst decision Melbourne has ever made is to use trams, particularly in the city area. It's like blocking the arteries of the blood vessels. It constrains and constricts, increase the transport time, which indirectly increase the business cost of goods and services. Same thing happens when you eliminate parking spaces, for example. So my proposal for a project, PhD project, would be, my theory is that hypothesis that the more neoliberal a city or a country is, the less likely it is to use trams instead of buses or trolley buses, for example. So
your specific question is?
Sorry?
Your specific question is?
No, I'm just suggesting a research project.
Right, okay.
The correlation coefficient of at least 0.3 between how neoliberal a country or city is and to the extent to which it's likely to use trams or such transport which constricts the transport use, reduces transport productivity.
Okay, if anyone would like to respond to that proposal, if there's, I think you've all mostly done PhDs, other than Richard, I think, on the group. But if anyone would like to briefly comment.
My own experience, and I think I probably reflect on the experience of everyone here, that if we feel passionate, we came in to do a PhD often driven by a passion that we had ourselves. It wasn't so much that we picked up an idea that somebody else had and explored that. And so if you feel passionate, about that sort of topic, I think, a PhD would be a great journey for you to explore that and research that topic the way we've embraced our own topics. Yeah, but maybe look, and people in business are in a great opportunity to offer scholarships to perhaps younger people who would welcome the opportunity to research that sort of topic. So there's a few ways to skin that cat.
Okay, well, I think we'll need to wrap up here. So I'd just like to thank everyone who's participated today for your inputs, especially the PhD students for the work that you've done and some are still continuing to do. But also thank you so much to Taru and Richard for coming and visiting us here at RMIT and sharing the insights from your own professional practice and from your research, Taru, as well. So thanks, everyone. Please put your hands together. So this is the last session in the Graduate Research Symposium, Urban Futures Graduate Research Symposium for 2023. Before we let you go to lunch, I just need to announce the prize winners of our poster exhibition, which is on display out in the foyer there next to where the food is. So if you haven't seen the posters, you'll be able to look at them while you have a sandwich or two. The poster exhibition is awarding prizes. It's the first time we've run it as a graduate research symposium activity. There are 3 prizes, first, second and third, and also a People's Prize. The prizes were awarded on a combination of factors, including the visual appeal of the poster, the readability and legibility, as well as the presentation of the scientific content in terms of statement of the key questions and purpose of the research, the methodology, the findings, and the potential impact of the research. I'm not sure if the awardees will be in the audience here, but the first prize went to Alicia Kuzmich. In case Alicia is here. Well done, Alicia. Second prize went to Kilda Wildana Nur. Is Kilda here? Please come up and receive your prize, Kilda. Congratulations. There is some prize money associated with this, but we weren't able to print out a giant cheque, but we'll follow up afterwards. And lastly, I'm very delighted to award third prize to Mehdi Aladadi for your work. Congratulations. Thank you. And there was also a People's Prize, so that the audience who've come through the venue over the last 4 days were able to swipe on a QR code and vote for the favourite poster. And Mustafa Jur Rahman was awarded the People's Prize, or the Peer Prize. So please take a moment to see all the posters, including the prize winners, as you're having some lunch. This is the last session of the GRS, so I'd just like to finish up by thanking all the PhD students across the 4 days who have delivered their milestones. It's a big moment in the PhD experience to be undertaking a milestone, so congratulations to all of those who have presented. I'd also like to thank the speakers today, and also those who've spoken across the 4 days, including Professor Rob Raven at the plenary in this venue yesterday. And then lastly, I'd also like to thank the coordination and support staff who've assisted with the running of the GRS, and in fact have run it as much as I have. Anastasia Barker, Nicole Scott, Alan Shanks and Alex Padge as well, plus colleagues Sisley Wong and Jessica Hattersley from the School of Graduate Research team, who coordinated a lot of the PhD milestones. So it's been a good 4 days. We've had lots of great conversations, including today. So I'm pleased to draw the Graduate Research Symposium to a close and invite you all to partake of some lunch outside.